Hi, everyone, and welcome to Wellness in the Real World, Episode 5. SMART goals are everywhere in health, fitness, and workplace well-being. But what if the framework most of us were taught to rely on really isn't supported by the evidence and could even be working against us? In this episode, I am going to sit down with Professor Christian Swann from Southern Cross University in Australia. Christian leads the Physical Activity, Sport, and Exercise Research theme, heads up the Open Goals Lab, and is a chief investigator at the Mana Institute. His research has challenged the widespread use of SMART goals for physical activity promotion, and his work on open goals is changing how practitioners think about motivation and performance. We talk openly about why SMART goals can increase pressure and tension rather than reduce it, what an open goal actually looks like in practice, and how these findings apply well beyond fitness, workplace well-being, and rehabilitation and everyday life. Hi, Christian. Welcome to Wellness in the Real World. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be here.
So I've spoken a little bit about your background, but would you mind telling us a little bit more about kind of what you're currently working on?
Sure. So I'm a professor in psychology based at Southern Cross University in Australia on the East Coast. I lead a physical activity, sport, and exercise research group. We sort of cover that across physical activity promotion, sport, ranging from community sport and youth sport through to elite sport. And we do stuff in workplace injury rehabilitation at the moment as well.
Okay, that's amazing. So all focused on goal setting related to physical activity, health, sport, and the workplace as well. I know that I came across your work when I was reading about the current research in SMART goals and goal setting and thinking about the curriculum that we were teaching our students at Sheffield Hallam University. And I came across your expert statement on exercise and sports science and how goal setting relates to physical activity and exercise. And so that paper was really interesting to me. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that today.
Sure. So I guess the expert statement that we published at the start of this year, we believe that's the first statement to be endorsed by a national peak body worldwide, focusing specifically on goal setting and exercise and physical activity. So we're very grateful to Exercise and Sports Science Australia for endorsing that piece of work. And I guess starting there and working backwards, that paper is really designed to help the field go back to basics on goal setting. Mm-hmm. We've seen over the last decade that our scientific understanding of how to set goals in physical activity has changed as evidence has come out, as we've got better understanding of prominent theories. And so we've kind of got to a point where it seemed like the next step that we needed to take was just to really help the field go back to basics. And so that expert statement is designed to outline all of the core considerations of goal setting. Excuse me, starting with, just what are goals and are we sure that we're clear on what they are before we do anything else, right the way through to things that influence what type of goals people pursue in certain circumstances, how goals work, what the outcomes can be, the fact that there's over 20 different types of goal and each one of those does different things, works in different ways, produces different outcomes. So we're seeing the field transition or evolve away from what's been a one-size-fits-all approach to now being much more about what type of goal works best for whom in what circumstance. And obviously with that comes a bit more sophistication and a little bit more complexity. But yeah, the purpose of our statement at the start of this year was really just to try and outline all the considerations that we are aware of based on 70 odd years of research on goal setting, apply it specifically to physical activity and exercise, and hopefully use that as a starting point for, like you mentioned, when you're delivering courses or teaching units or doing professional development, whatever it may be. We sort of hope that statement might be a useful go-to.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. And thank you so much for your work. I know myself and many others, we still teach SMART goals. And, your paper kind of talked about how there's more nuance, there's more complexity. That line, what works for whom under what circumstances and why, is familiar to me because I did a realist evaluation during my PhD, and I always ask, what works for whom under what circumstances and why. The context really matters. But with that complexity, it requires a bit more maybe education or experience or time to set those goals. Is that something that you found in your work?
I mean, yes, I think the popularity of the SMART acronym lies in its simplicity. And, for a long time, that's been great, and there hasn't been a reason to ask questions of the SMART acronym. And in doing so, it's enabled a lot of people to become fairly familiar with an approach to goal setting. And like I said, it's really only in the last decade or so that we've actually had reasons to ask questions of whether that's the best we can be doing. And by asking those questions, we're essentially realizing that the SMART acronym isn't a great way of setting specific goals. Specific goals themselves can still be very, very useful for many people, but if you're working with a tool that's not in line with evidence, if it's not based on underpinning theory, if it's used inconsistently, there's just a few of some fairly big issues that essentially we think we can do better than that as a field. So, and I think another reflection I have is that we're sort of right at the tipping point, I think, in all of this. Over the last sort of 5 years or so, I think we've become a bit more aware of possible issues out there. But it's only really now that we're starting to say, okay, well, this is what we can and should be doing instead. And even then, we're sort of guessing in some cases at the moment, because there are pretty big studies underway at the moment, and certainly
Yes.
major funded projects will be published in the next 2 to 3 years. So it takes a while to really build evidence for the solutions. But the place we're in at this point in time, I think, is recognizing that one size fits all doesn't suit everybody. That we do need to be a bit more aware of context, like you mentioned, and identifying what works best for whom and what circumstances. And in doing so, I think our job as researchers is to help people recognize the variety of options available, help them, become familiar with them and learn about them and upskill in them, and also test them out in their own practice and in the real world. And yeah, I think it's important for us as researchers to help practitioners to go through that process of almost experimentation and trial and error and see what outcomes they can see with different options, which then also will translate down into the people who are trying to be more active in the first place. I think they also will go through some experimenting and trial and error and see what works for them too. And, even amongst our own team, we talk and think about goal setting pretty much all day, every day. And our own team members have different kind of takes on things, and will use different strategies in different situations depending on various factors. So we're kind of moving towards that, where people are much more aware of the whole range of options, and they've practiced them, and they can kind of know what to expect with them. But yeah, I think that's what's coming next. I think where we're at the moment is that sort of tipping point from recognizing that one size isn't going to work for everyone, and recognizing that we can be a bit more sophisticated with things, and it's our job as researchers to help everyone work with the various options available moving forward.
Yeah, it sounds like, there's quite a bit of context, or context really matters, and there's quite a bit of nuance really in goal setting, which can make things difficult when kind of social media and the general public kind of want a one size fits all, or one answer that's easy, or a one simple formula that's easy to follow. And you said, SMART goals aren't evidence-based for physical activity. Besides the simple acronym, why do you think they became so popular if the evidence doesn't really fully support them?
I think for a long time, like I said, the field hasn't needed to ask questions about this. I think for a long time, as often happens with scientific paradigms, things continue on fairly well. And it's only once you start identifying anomalies that you then raise the questions and look into them, and that can then result in paradigm shifts. I think, the starting point of that a decade ago was a paper by Desmond McEwen and his colleagues at UBC, and Mark Beauchamp worked on that as well. They led a systematic review and meta-analysis of goal-setting interventions in physical activity, and they identified something really interesting to me, which was that overall goals had a medium positive effect on physical activity, which is good news. But they found that there was no significant difference between setting goals that were specific versus vague. So what that means is that you could produce a best practice, really intricate, evidence-based, specific goals program in line with all of the latest evidence and knowledge and theory that we have, or you could simply ask someone to be more active, and both of those would produce equivalent results. So that to me said that what we're doing as best practice isn't deriving any additional benefits beyond just something quite vague. And then that really sort of started our thinking around, well, what should best practice look like? And building on the empirical evidence that they summarized, then that led us down a path of looking into underpinning theories. So goal setting theory being one that we looked at. And then that led us into the SMART acronym and other projects I've been working on since as well. So yeah, the last decade I think has been one of change for research on this strategy. But prior to that, I don't think there was a need to think critically about it. I think our field adopted SMART goals because that's what other fields were using. They seemed like they had success, so we assumed that we would have success too.
Mm.
That's what organizations adopted, that's what practitioners were taught, that's what students were taught. So I don't think it's anyone's fault that we ended up where we did. I think it's just how paradigms operate in science, that one thing is accepted until there's reasons to question it, and then if you identify something better, then you shift into that instead. And I think that's sort of where we're at the moment.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting. And you mentioned that there are so many types of goals. I think, oftentimes maybe practitioners aren't aware of the many different types of goals. One thing you mentioned is an open goal. Could you tell us a little bit about how that's different, and an example of what open goals sound like in practice?
Sure. So open goals are deliberately non-specific. They're exploratory and they avoid binary outcomes that are essentially about succeeding or failing. Instead, they're much more about the extent to which you achieve something. So, as an example, I have this morning I did a 11K run, so I know the distance. Wow. And my goal was to see how fast I can do that time. So it's not about having a really clear, specific benchmarks or milestones throughout the run or anything like that. It gave me flexibility to run depending on my energy levels, given that it was early-ish in the morning and it was cold. Yeah. It just meant that I could still challenge myself and I could get as much out of myself as was possible within that situation without coming up with some preconceived idea of what a good run should look like.
Yes.
So whenever we set open goals, the sort of ethos is about seeing how well you can do at that task. So another example that we're testing at the moment is to, instead of asking people to reach 7,000 steps or 10,000 steps or whatever number it might be, we're asking them to see how many steps they can reach each day.
Wow.
And so that program's called Open to Move. It's funded by the Australian Research Council. We're expecting to publish it probably next year. And that's a 12-month study based on a walking program. Oh, wow. And yeah, so we've got over 210 participants. We'll have done over 2,000 one-to-one meetings across the course of that project, all of which are recorded as qualitative data. So there's a mountain of data that we're working through, and that will start to be published next year. But the goal that we're setting in that is see how many steps you can reach each day.
Wow. Okay.
And so we think that the nature of an open goal is more flexible, and it's exploratory as well, which we think is a really key component. So that combination, we think, explains why we're seeing positive psychological outcomes when people pursue open goals. There's still increasing physical activity.
Yes.
And we think that open goals for some people may be better suited to sustained physical activity long term because they're inherently flexible to the daily fluctuations in energy, motivation, resources, time, everything.
Like we all are.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. When I teach indoor cycling classes or other fitness classes and I'm doing certain intervals, I tend to give people specific RPE and an RPM if I'm doing cycling that they need to work towards. And I say, work to your own 8 or whatever out of 10 for that specific day. And I always say, we're not robots. We show up with what we have each day, but some people are very uncomfortable with that. And they want to know, specifically what level of resistance they are on the bike. Everybody's different, but they want to know everything very specifically. And they're a little bit uncomfortable with that. But I wondered, when you were talking about all of this, is there a certain type of person that an open goal is better suited towards? Or
yes, we're working on that. I mean, inherent in your question is a really, really good point that open goals aren't a one-size-fits-all either. So, at best, open goals are an additional option for practitioners and people out there to consider. And, in my own physical activity, sometimes I'll use a specific goal, sometimes I'll use an open goal. So it's definitely not like a replacement one-size-fits-all. And we have a PhD student actually at the moment his thesis is looking at the moderators of open goals to try and understand what factors influence for whom they're beneficial versus not. It's a pretty complex thing actually. And there's a lot of factors that go into it. So you mentioned personality, and that is certainly one factor that may influence. Other factors include how active people are. So we've seen in previous studies that more active people seem to derive more benefits from specific goals, whereas less active people seem to derive more benefits from open goals. But that's also not a blanket rule either. We see things like prior goal setting knowledge, prior goal setting experience playing into this too. So some people are trained, salespeople, for example, are typically trained in setting very specific goals. And for some people, that can be really hard to let go of. So they bring that into the activity. But equally, some people are sick of that. And so it makes it really easy for them to adopt a different approach. So you can see there's a whole range of different factors here that can kind of influence what type of goal people are likely to pursue. And the best advice that we can give at the moment, based on what we know, is to just offer people choice.
Okay. Wow.
I don't think we're in a position based on scientific understanding yet to sort of prescribe to people what goals they should be pursuing in given circumstances. We can certainly hazard pretty good guesses, but I don't think we're sort of so refined in our understanding that we can predict what will work with a high degree of certainty. So instead, I think it's about offering people choice. And like you mentioned, it sounds like some of your clients are pretty happy to adopt what sounds like a bit of a process goal in terms of focusing on RPE, whereas other people have cravings for different stuff. And so you being able to offer choice is a much better approach than trying to do a one size fits all.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I think being able to hold that nuance that there isn't a one size all fit approach for everybody can be challenging for people that have done things a certain way for a long time, or for practitioners that might be kind of limited in time or opportunity to learn more about goal setting. And I think across all fields of science, being able to hold that nuance is a good skill to have, but challenging. You talk about how kind of SMART goals can increase pressure and tension. Is there a type of person or situation where SMART goals would work well?
I don't think SMART goals are a good way of setting specific goals.
Mm-hmm.
Specific goals, yes, absolutely can be useful in many circumstances. The blanket kind of rule of thumb that I mentioned earlier is that people who are more active are likely to have the moderating factors according to goal setting theory, including existing commitment, existing knowledge, existing ability, the resources available to do the task well. And when those things are there, a specific challenging goal is likely to produce better performance outcomes. And there's some evidence in physical activity that they can also produce positive psychological outcomes for those people too. So, as a rule of thumb, people who are more active are maybe in a better position to derive benefits from specific goals. And I think that makes sense. If you think about where goal setting came from, it's from industrial, organizational, business contexts, and it's effectively a tool for getting more out of people who already know how to do their job. So if you sort of transpose that onto physical activity, people who are fairly active already and know how to do the job, specific goals may help them get more out of themselves. But the difficulty in our field is that the majority of the population aren't those people. And so that's why we are taking it pretty seriously around trying to understand what might work better for them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of the majority of those people who are not active is where we can make the biggest impact. So I think if people are thinking about like, why does this even matter? It really does, because it has a knock-on effect on who's going to adopt these health promoting behaviors, such as physical activity, which has a knock-on effect on health outcomes or productivity in the workplace, for example. So, it really does matter, and it's important to get it right.
Totally. And even business outcomes as well. For practitioners who are running small businesses or part of businesses, if you're attracting new members, if you're retaining members, if they're renewing memberships, if they're happy customers who are coming back, there's business outcomes, I think, as well.
Yes.
And I think, to contradict my last answer around who specific goals are useful for, again, I'm just very cautious around sort of blanket statements, because specific goals, even for active people in certain circumstances, can still lead to detrimental outcomes. And that's also something that we're becoming much more aware of, I think, in the field over the last decade. There are suggestions, at least, that specific goals can lead to detrimental outcomes, like you mentioned, stress, anxiety, pressure, perceptions of failure, means to an end kind of engagement. So, the people who sign up for a run and train and do the run, and then having completed the run is an excuse to put their feet up for the next few months.
Yeah, yeah,
Schools to style participation. And we've also kind of raised the question of whether there's a risk of unintentionally exacerbating mental health symptoms that people may be
I was
experiencing.
curious about that.
Yeah, so a really kind of intuitive example, I think, is people with symptoms of depression who may well be seeing and reading and hearing that physical activity is going to be good for their mental health, so they sign up
Yes.
for a program or go to the internet and download resources on what they should be doing. And if they then fail to achieve the goals that the program is setting, then it's logical, I think, that that has a risk of exacerbating the symptoms of depression that they're experiencing in the first place. So, and that could happen for someone who's active or insufficiently active. So, again, I think we just need to be more aware of how we're setting goals and what we know the goals will do. And we need to just be more sophisticated than relying on the SMART acronym as the be all and end all for how we set goals in our sector.
That's really interesting. When you were talking about the kind of the mental health repercussions of setting certain types of goals, I was also curious about kind of something we don't talk a lot about in the physical activity, sport and exercise space. I don't think enough, but kind of perfectionistic tendencies with certain types of goals. I was thinking if someone said to somebody who was quite perfectionistic about an open goal, oh, do as many steps as you can, that's an invitation for, a challenge. But for some people, it's like, oh, let me see how many I can do today. That's, a little bit more than yesterday. So I was curious kind of if there's a kind of middle ground or something that you found in that area.
Absolutely. Really, really good point. We have data essentially for both sides of that. So people with perfectionism who see greater risk with open goals because it's essentially a license to push themselves even harder. But on the flip side, other people with perfectionism say that it alleviates their perfectionism because they can be more flexible.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, the flexibility.
yeah, you can probably see why we think the best we can do at this point is to offer people choice as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to feeling like we're able to prescribe a type of goal for someone, because there's just so many different things that we're seeing around people's adoption of open goals or specific goals or their preferences that, yeah, it sounds like quite straightforward advice, but I think if we as a field at this point in time at least are simply offering a choice, and I think we can reasonably confidently distill that choice down into a specific goal or an open goal. I think the likelihood is that those two options will be relevant to the vast majority of the population. Then I think that's going to produce better outcomes, and certainly better than trying to impose a one size fits all, which we know is likely to be problematic.
Yeah, that is really interesting. This is kind of aside from SMART goals, but I was also curious about the size of goals. When I was working in the workplace wellbeing clinic at Sheffield Hallam, we would often, and this kind of preceded me coming into the clinic, but employees wanted to, we'd help them to set like little goals that they'd write on cards that they'd take and put at their desk. And I would often say, let's set a really achievable, realistic goal that is just slightly outside of what you're doing right now that you could achieve immediately when you walk out of this room today. Because sometimes people would come to me and they would not be active at all. And then they would say, oh, I'm going to go out of here. I'm going to get a gym membership. I'm going to exercise 6 days a week. And I said, well, you're not doing any of that right now. So let's set you up for success. And, what could you do when you walk out of this room? Maybe it's researching gym memberships. Maybe it's, planning what you're going to do. But now looking back, I was thinking if they're able to achieve this small goal, they build that self-confidence and that kind of self-efficacy that they can do that, and then that snowballs. But then I've worked in other sectors where a former manager tried to set for us employees huge goals that were almost ridiculous because he said, well, if you don't achieve that, at least we're achieving some of that. But to me, that was almost demotivating. And I was just curious. It sounds like this is again going to that one size doesn't fit all approach, but like the size of goals, is there anything that your research shows about that?
Yes. So Locke and Latham's theory says that the most effective goals are those that are specific and challenging in the right circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So, within the SMART acronym, the A is often interpreted to be achievable. And yes, people can sort of adjust that higher or lower. But to be in line with scientific theory, if we're setting specific goals, we should be setting specific challenging goals in order to derive those positive outcomes. Yes, we often hear people kind of talk about, excuse me, like, why don't we just set easier specific goals? Doesn't that solve everything? I think there's a couple of issues. One is that we've spoken with people who have said that if you fail to achieve a goal that's been made even easier, that can make you feel even worse.
Okay. Okay.
Inherent in setting a specific goal is the possibility of failure.
Yes.
And we're working on a project that we expect to be published sometime before too long, which is identifying that the majority of people out there fail to achieve goals in physical activity programs. And so, yeah, even if you adopt a very small or sort of easy specific goal, inherent in that still is a possibility of failure. And if you do fail, there's a risk that it can make you feel even worse. There's also, I think, an issue in terms of sort of, behavior change, habit formation, in the sense of that the small specific goals can sort of cap your activity. So if your only goal is to do like 5 minutes of walking and you do that, then that can stop you doing more. And it can sort of give you license to put your feet up for the rest of the day.
Sure, sure, sure.
Whereas what we see with open goals is because they're exploratory, it's an ongoing drive to see how many steps you can accumulate. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to accumulate, 6 hours worth of walking or anything like that. But if you hit the 5 minutes, we think that the intrinsic motivation is still there to keep exploring what you're capable of doing on that day. So, and I think another piece in all of this, and sort of the core ethos of our research team really is not even so much about sort of maximizing the physical activity outcomes or the behavioral outcomes, but we're really, really interested in the psychological experience that people have while they're pursuing these tasks. Because, we know things like affect, predict long-term maintenance of physical activity. We know the importance of things like self-efficacy and enjoyment and intrinsic motivation. And we think that for someone to start with some physical activity and stick with it for the next few decades, they're going to need to have a good experience. So when it comes, exactly, and the data that we're seeing from specific goals and insufficiently active people is that the psychological factors aren't as positive. Even if you are setting small specific goals that may be achievable, we don't actually think that's likely to derive the extent of positive psychological outcomes that is possible based on the data we're seeing from open goals. So if you look at it through that lens of what's going to be sort of the best experience people can have while they're being active, that's a core reason why our team is working hard to understand more about how and why open goals may and may not be helpful.
Wow. Yeah, we know that positive experience is really important, when we're trying to build a habit, especially for people that had really negative experiences early on. And I'm just curious, can you say a little bit more about why people that are using more open goals have a more positive experience when it comes to physical activity?
Yeah. So at the moment, we've sort of got best guesses. We're planning, I mentioned the Open to Move project.
Yes.
We're going to finish data collection in September, and next year we should hopefully have a paper that kind of explains everything we're seeing. In terms of best guesses, we know that when you set a specific goal, you're essentially creating like an ideal future state that you want to be in, which by definition means that you're not your ideal self at that point, and it creates a deficit between where you want. Yeah, it's a deficit between where you are now and where you want to get to. And the whole process of pursuing that goal is about reducing the deficit. So you're essentially behind where you want to be, and we think that might dampen things like the confidence that people can derive.
Wow.
Whereas when you pursue a non-specific goal, you don't know specifically what your endpoint is going to be. And so your progress is judged relative to your starting point, which we think makes it more about accomplishment building. So, as a really simple example, if you start at 2,000 steps and your aim is 10,000 steps, and tomorrow you reach 4,000 steps, you're still 6,000 steps behind where you want to be. Whereas with a non-specific goal, if you start with 2,000 and get to 4,000, you've doubled your physical activity. So you feel amazing about it. And so framing, I think, about how you're gauging your progress, we think that is likely to explain some of the psychological factors that we see people reporting. In addition to things I mentioned earlier around flexibility, which we know is really important.
Yeah, really important.
When you're seeing how well you can do, you have autonomy over what's happening. So we think that's important as well in terms of intrinsic motivation. And people report that they feel like they've done the task really, really well after non-specific goals, which again, we think is that sense of accomplishment because they've doubled their physical activity rather than reducing the gap from 8,000 to 6,000.
Yeah, all in the framing.
Totally. Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. I think framing really matters. It's something I talk about a lot, and that's really interesting to hear it applied to goal setting. So, my podcast, speaks to kind of a wide variety of practitioners, from those that work in workplace well-being to health, physical activity, and fitness. But let's just talk about a situation. So let's say I'm a fitness instructor or a personal trainer, and I have someone come in that says to me, I want to lose 10 pounds. How should I respond, kind of knowing now what we know about goal setting?
I think if you're a physical activity practitioner, first and foremost, then I would assume that you would kind of start working through what their behavior is likely to be in a physical activity sense. I think from a goal setting perspective, like I mentioned earlier, in terms of people actually accepting and committing to a goal, I think you're likely to be able to do that better if you offer choice of a couple of options. We know from meta-analyses in sport as well as in other areas that more process focused goals are likely to be more effective than outcome focused goals. So, I think sort of standard messaging around focusing on the next thing you need to do and what, the behaviors that you need to actually adopt and sustain, I think they're really important. But from a goal setting perspective, where we think practitioners can go is actually having a conversation with clients around goal setting. So, what has their experience of goal setting been before? What types of goals have they used and have they worked? Have they not worked? What's been their experience as a result of those goals? What would they like to avoid? Would they be open to trying something new and experimenting? Do they like the sound of a specific goal, or do they like the sound of an open goal? Give them flexibility to experiment and chop and change as well. And, it's not the case that whatever they start with, they need to stick to the whole way through, but just have it as an ongoing conversation, I would say. Again, we've got a paper that we've got under review at the moment, which kind of speaks to this a little bit in terms of different ways that people can have the conversation around goal setting and sort of different scenarios where you can sort of try different options and how you can go about trying different options with goal setting. Because even, in Open to Move, where we're meeting with people fortnightly for the first 6 months, some people pick up open goals when you first mention it to them and they kind of understand it and they're able to follow open goals really nicely. Other people can take 2 months to kind of just try it and make sense of it and let go of their preconceptions around goal setting and then arrive at a place where open goals are usable for them. So we don't see any uniformity in how people respond. To do justice to your client's experiences, have a conversation with them and give them some options and, trust that they'll be able to identify what their preferences are, and by doing so, they'll be in a better position to pursue them as well. But certainly, I think as a practitioner, you can encourage reflection as well on the client and support them through phases of experimentation as well. And ask them if what you think they're experiencing actually aligns with their true experience, and check in around if they are pursuing an open goal, for example, if it is actually deriving the positive experiential outcomes that we think they typically experience. And if not, work with them to try other options. This is where, once you move away from a one size fits all, it sort of opens the doors to all sorts of different complexities around how you can go about it. But I would say that, we're really conscious of, as researchers, we don't want to make life harder for practitioners.
Sure.
We want to help them use more effective practice, but we also know that we need to be able to make that easy for practitioners. So a lot of the research that we've done so far has been researcher driven, essentially, in terms of delivering goals. But my belief is that one of the next phases of our research will be much more about how we can put open goals in the hands of practitioners in a way that works for them, in a way that they're able to use effectively, and that we provide resources and guidance and training and materials to help do that well. So we're conscious of not just kind of opening up a can of worms and then leaving practitioners to figure it out.
Well, Christian, that's a brilliant answer. I think that is wonderful. So many times in, training for curriculum for exercise instructors, fitness instructors, physical activity experts, whichever kind of country you're in, and then the nomenclature used, behavior change as a whole is just glossed over. And I think it's always seen as like a lesser part of that curriculum. But I think it is so important for one of the biggest reasons that you've highlighted, well, specifically to what you're doing, but more broadly, people that have a good experience are more likely to come back. There's that retention. There's, that knock-on effect of adherence to physical activity. And, just by listening to them and having these discussions, people are going to feel, like they're listened to and have a better experience overall. But I was just thinking, as you were talking about all of this, the challenge that this presents, because there's not a one size fits all approach. There's not just one tick box that can be added to an electronic health record, but people are complex. Important that we have those conversations, but I'm so happy to know that you're going to be working on some sort of set of resources or streamlined process that could guide practitioners in the field that don't have all day to research the topic like yourself.
Totally, because it's complex, and we've already talked about how the SMART acronym became so popular because it was so simple to use.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
For knowledge translation of research, it's important that things like simplicity and practicality are there. It just takes a lot of work to get there. So our job is
watering it down.
Exactly. Yeah, our job is to generate the evidence, but then figure out how to convey it in a way that's usable in the real world and still effective in the real world too. We're already having conversations with peak bodies around what their needs are and how professional development can be rolled out and what it could look like. And we're working with various industry partners. We launched a project with Almanac Health earlier this year in Australia, which we're working on at the moment. So we're, like I said, very conscious of it, working already to try and provide useful resources. But that's certainly going to be a core focus of our research, I think, over the next sort of 5 years or so. Just making sure that we do a really good job of making it all usable for practitioners.
Wow, that's really exciting. I look forward to more of that coming out. But it sounds like, right now practitioners could focus on giving people an option. There's so many ways, different types of goals, but it sounds like, specific or open goals, figuring out what has worked well for people in the past, what hasn't worked well in terms of goal setting. I think so many times we talk about what works well in terms of the specific behavior of physical activity, what hasn't worked well, but we don't talk about what has worked well in terms of actually setting the goal. So, maybe having a few more conversations around what types of goals have you set before? Why hasn't this worked? Why hasn't it worked? What worked well?
Totally. Yeah. And, I guess another piece that I would encourage practitioners to do is to try different types of goal yourselves and see what your experiences are and reflect on those so that you're able to meet the client where they're at in terms of thinking through what options would work for them. In my own exercise, I regularly switch between open goals and specific goals depending on what I'm trying to do, or depending on how I'm feeling or how much time I've got.
Yeah.
And typically, even my goals across a week will change. Like if I'm home for the week and I've got a stable routine and schedule, then I'm happy to set myself specific goals to kind of push myself to sort of do a bit more. But if my routine is disrupted and I've got travel for work or whatever it might be, then I can only really do an open goal just to see how much I can. And at least, by the end of that week, I'm not feeling bad about anything. I'm sort of counting what the wins have been. By switching between those two, I'm able to sort of stay and sustain a level of physical activity that I'm happy with.
And being happy with it and being okay with that process as well, I think is interesting. I mean, looking back, I don't think I did this intentionally, but I used to be a ballet dancer when I was younger. And so we had very strict parameters around the physical activity, the dance. And I think over the years, I just kind of moved away from that. And then I realized, okay, I'm more comfortable with, let's say I'm going to get 4 days of strength training in this week, but, what that looks like, or some days I'll be a bit more specific and, I'll say I want to get all of my major movement patterns and full body exercise 4 times a week. But I don't tend to go more specific than that because it makes me feel I don't enjoy the process as much, but there's certain times I am more specific, maybe when it comes to like rehabbing an injury or something. But it's interesting. And I think being willing to explore those things yourself as a practitioner is really important.
Yeah. And I fully get that it's harder for a practitioner to map out, what a 12-week program might look like in incorporating all of that flexibility. But
yeah.
I think having those options to use on a daily and weekly basis are likely to help you derive better outcomes over the course of those 12 weeks. So, those are the kind of practical things that we still need to get our heads around in terms of offering advice on how practitioners can go about this. But yeah, like I said, I would really encourage practitioners to play around with it yourselves and, see what goal setting options you like or dislike and reflect on why that's the case. And then you can bring that into conversations with your clients and start being, hopefully a bit more meaningful, a bit more empowering, a bit more sophisticated than off-the-shelf SMART goals that we've been using for quite a while.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. So I guess I just have a couple more quick questions. Kind of beyond the fitness, physical activity, and sports side of things, do you think we like just think maybe about workplace well-being? I know you mentioned there's some work that you do there, rehabilitation, everyday and everyday life. Do you think we're overcomplicating goal setting in general?
I would say we've undercomplicated goal
Okay.
setting.
Okay.
Yeah. We know the SMART acronym is prevalent across sectors, it's worldwide. All of what we've talked about in a physical activity context, I think, is likely to apply in many other domains as well.
Yeah.
Particularly because goal setting theory kind of is about distilling down into the core dynamics of how goals work, which shouldn't really be influenced across different sectors. So yes, long term, we would love to be able to do essentially behavior change research across a variety of different domains where goals are relevant,
Mm-hmm.
as well as things like business, education, entrepreneurship. There's a whole variety of different sectors out there that use goal setting very, very prominently. Again, the nature of scientific paradigms, I think, is that everything is accepted while we know that that's what we think is the best way to go. And then once you start identifying a different option that is driving better results, then the paradigm sort of shifts. And I think naturally what happens from that is that it flows into the real world and practice changes once the scientific paradigm is shifted. To me, it feels a bit like we're on the precipice and sort of a tipping point in terms of what a paradigm shift might be. But I would hazard a guess, if we think ahead to the next 10 years, that other sectors will look at what we're doing in physical activity and hopefully see that evidence points to better outcomes and that they would be adopting similar thought processes around being a bit more sophisticated. And I think, an important point in all of this is that we're not kind of doing it for the sake of it. Mm-hmm. We're not questioning traditional practice just for the sake of it, but we're seeing data that is pointing to much better outcomes, which then, if they happen in the real world, would lead to really meaningful health benefits for people. So as long as the data is telling us that we are actually doing a better job, then I think other sectors may well look to us and get curious about what they can do as well.
Wow, that's really helpful. I think sometimes there's a belief that academic fields focus on, things, and there's not really that practical application, but this is a really meaningful practical application for so many different sectors, and that knock-on effect on quality of life and health outcomes. So it's really helpful. If you could change one thing about how the fitness industry teaches goal setting, what would that be?
Don't teach one size fits all.
Yeah.
And like I said, at the very start of this conversation, we talked about our statement endorsed by Exercise and Sports Science Australia. Mm-hmm. That, as I mentioned, is about going back to basics and just trying to help us as a field cover the basics well. So I would point any of your interested listeners to that paper. It's fully open access, and that kind of outlines how we can move away from an oversimplistic one-size-fits-all approach. Covers all of the core considerations that we know of in terms of goal setting. As we sort of talked about, our job as researchers is to help the field move away from one-size-fits-all, but at least as far as we're aware of, we haven't encountered any disagreements that, one-size-fits-all is best. So that would be the one thing that I would encourage the sector to embrace and just know that we as researchers are working hard to try and help give you resources and guidance that you can use in a way that doesn't make your life harder, hopefully.
More stressful, yeah. Well, we really appreciate that, genuinely appreciate the work that you're doing. Because it is important, but we will look forward to those resources.
I think it's been a great conversation, so thank you for that. One of the reasons that we're really interested in goal setting is because fundamentally we're talking about just rearranging a couple of words in a sentence. So I think that's quite a powerful thing for us as a field to really pay attention to, because we're not talking about huge, expensive equipment that we need or really complicated things. It's actually sensitive to try and get the wording right, but fundamentally that's all we're talking about. So I think with that comes a lot of potential, both in terms of incorporating into policies as well as training and education for both current practitioners as well as future generations of practitioners coming through universities. And ultimately, from a public health perspective, we think it's a feasible strategy to put in the hands of the general population as well, to hopefully derive meaningful changes in physical activity levels and the subsequent physical and mental health benefits that go along with that. So that, I think, is what drives a lot of the stuff that we do. The potential to do hopefully good things in a fairly simple way without being too complicated or requiring expensive equipment and stuff. Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on where the last 10 years has taken us as a field and to sort of think ahead to the next 10 years. And I think we hope that the conversation continues at all levels, so it's not just putting the emphasis on practitioners to do things when in many cases they're constrained by the policies that they're working under.
Yes. Yeah.
So we know that we need to have conversations at the policy level to be able to help work with practitioners to then have flow-on effects to the general population, as well as other strategies of reaching the general population. So it's a whole of sector thing. We're aware of that. And yeah, over the next 10 years, hopefully we can work across all of those layers to hopefully arrive at data that tells us that doing a more sophisticated job of goal setting actually does derive the benefits that we think it will.
Achieving 150 minutes of moderate, physical activity. Is there a way that we could even think about the messaging side of things? I don't know if these are interrelated at all.
Guidelines live.
So thank you so much for your time, especially with the massive time difference.
I'm probably most active on LinkedIn website.
That's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks everybody for listening today. If it was useful, please follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening to our current episode of Wellness in the Real World with Christian Swann. If you found this useful, please follow or subscribe on Spotify or YouTube. I'll be back with more conversations, really examining the truth about topics that matter to our health and well-being. Thank you so much and stay well.